One of my Patreon perks is that certain patrons can suggest episodes of stuff you like that they would like to see, and then other patrons can vote on them. And their first selections have been Small Gods, which is coming later, and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So can we just clear up this whole Susan Pevensie thing before we go any further? Too long didn't watch? Susan Pevensie! It's not about the lipstick. So at the end of the 7th Narnia book, The Last Battle, basically everybody dies. The Professor and Polly, Peter, Edmund and Lucy, Jill and Eustace, and even the Pevensie's parents. Because coincidentally, they're all on this same train and the train crashes and so they die. Because the Pevensies are dead, they can now return to Narnia before going on to Aslan's country. Because dead people are allowed to do that. For example, in the Silver Chair, King Caspian, who has just died in Narnia, is allowed to go briefly into our world before going on to Aslan's country. There's precedent, is what I'm saying. But Susan isn't there. And Peter says that Susan is no longer a friend of Narnia, and Edmund says that she doesn't want to talk about Narnia anymore and says it was all pretend. These are the important parts. And then Jill mentions lipstick and nylons and invitations, and Polly says something about wishing that Susan would grow up rather than just pretending to be grown up, and everybody loses their minds. So first, Susan Pevensie, as of The Last Battle, doesn't believe in Narnia anymore and mocks her siblings when they talk about it. Thus she is not at the meeting with the Friends of Narnia, thus she is not on the train, and so she's not dead yet. Second, as to whether or not Susan gets into Aslan's country in the end, C.S. Lewis said, in a 1960 letter to a child who wrote and asked, that Susan isn't there not because I have no hope of Susan ever getting back to Aslan's country, but because I have a feeling that the story of her journey would be longer and more like a grown-up novel than I wanted to write. But I may be mistaken. Why not try it yourself? So 2 thumbs up for encouraging fic writing, C.S. Lewis. Third, Susan Pevensie is the character to whom C.S. Lewis gives something closest to his own art. Lewis and Susan are both childhood believers and then adolescent atheists, but Lewis became a theist again at the age of 30 and then a Christian at the age of 32, so there's that as well. And if you're going to pick a Pevensie to have this arc, then Susan is the obvious choice. Peter is the High King, Edmund is the traitor redeemed, Lucy is the one who gets us into Narnia and the person for whom the books were written in the first place. Susan, frankly, has a much less defined role than the other characters. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, at least, she picks up some more character traits by Prince Caspian. And fourth, lipstick and nylons and invitations are probably more about the superficial materialist trappings of growing up rather than about sex or the awfulness of wanting to look pretty. Jill Pole likes her beautiful Narnian clothes so much that she smuggles them home and wears them to a fancy dress party. It's not pretty clothes that are the issue, it's the desire to act grown up without really stopping to question what that means. Lipstick and nylons and invitations are the superficial trappings of adulthood rather than the thing itself. Plus, nylons are a thing that C.S. Lewis would have really disapproved of, not because he hated tights on women or something, but because he was very concerned about materialism and disposability. He served in the trenches in the First World War and then in the Home Guard in the Second World War. He lived through 2 world wars, and rationing didn't actually end until 9 years after Armistice at the end of World War II. All of that make-do and mend stuff, as well as a suspicion of becoming too attached to earthly things, was something that Lewis was quite cognizant of. I mean, he wasn't even a fan of zips, because unlike buttons, you couldn't mend a zip at home if it broke. I always wondered about the ending of The Last Battle, and I get that the treatment of Susan is a hot-button issue for people. But even with death of the author and interpret things however you want, I figure it's important to ask what the author was going for, and then if necessary critique how they did it, rather than just being annoyed at what I think he means 60 years later without trying to understand the context. To sum up then, let me quote the man himself on the subject of being adult. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. And in childhood and adolescence they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow. But to carry on into middle life or even into early manhood, this concern about being adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. Oh, and lastly, I would like to take this opportunity to apologise to Inksplotch on Tumblr because I collected my tweets about Susan Pevensie and put them on there, and people keep tagging her, and I imagine it got a bit annoying after like the 4th time, so Sorry. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the show, I have a Patreon page, obviously, because otherwise how would patrons vote on things? If you like listening to me ramble, I have a Twitter at Jill Bearup, and if you're a Narnia fan, look out for my review of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which will be coming soon.